The wind tore through the barren plain, dry and merciless, and the ranch windows rattled as if afraid of what might come. He rose before the pale winter sun, as he always had, with the steadiness of a man accustomed to moving by routine rather than thought. The house sat low, half swallowed by the scrub, its paint peeled to the color of old bone. He liked it that way. The silence inside suited him. Silence kept company with the ache he had learned to live beside. He made coffee in a tin pot, black as the hills that watched the long road, and the kettle clinked like a small, honest protest against the cold. He listened to the sound of his own hands working, those calluses, the small movements of a life measured in chores, and he let the memory sit where it had settled, a weight that made him stoop just slightly across the back. He had been a young man once, carrying too much fire for the world. He had a wife who sang when she swept the floor. He had a claim he stubbornly defended. He had ridden out once and come back to a grave on the hill, the blanket she used to hang on the fence still smelling faintly of lavender and her laugh gone with the wind. After that, he learned the language of small things. The way a door closed, the way a horse snorted, the way a child's footstep made the floor complain. He learned to speak with fewer words and to answer with steadier hands. He named his best horse Red for the streak of sun in her mane. Red had saved him more times than he could count, and when she moved about the corral, dense muscle under dust, he felt a kinship with the animal's calm, as if her breath and his were the same weather. He kept the horse for work, for company, for habit, though he never let anyone ride her with the sack of sentiment he carried. People came and went at the edges of his life like birds on a wire. They called him stoic, stubborn, sometimes cruel, but what they called cruelty was the armor that stopped him from being blown over by things he could not control. The town was small and quick with its judgments. He built his days so no gossip could find a place to lodge inside them. He had a fence and a stove and a field that yielded only when he yielded to its timing. He had no children left to holler and complain and tell him what time it was. He had the hill with a single, small stone where the name he had loved carved itself into dusk. He had a life that would not be complicated any more unless he chose otherwise, and he had chosen simplicity as one chooses a stubborn path after a storm. They came to the valley that winter with a small procession of bad luck that no one in town could ignore. The wagon was a skeleton of what the road could chew down to. One wheel rim bent, the tarp patched with scrap cloth that had become stiff with mud, and a child's breath fogging the inside of the canvas. She walked beside it, barefoot only in the sense that the world had taken everything from her but kept her feet in honest contact with the ground. Her coat was gone. What she wore was thin. Layered rags meant more to cover than to keep warmth. Her hair, long and dark, clung to her shoulders in a way that suggested she had been more salt than water, more dust than river. People moved aside when she came, like stray animals giving the road its space. But the sheriff watched too closely with the mind of a man who could read trouble 2 days away. They said she belonged to no one then and to many stories, one half-town's rumor of theft, another half's of a broken marriage. Children pointed fingers and were told to stop by their mothers, because there was a law in some hearts against making spectacle of suffering. The man in the house watched from the ridge because he watched the valley, and the valley watched him back as if hoping for mercy from the kind of man who believed mercy was earned rather than given. She was an Apache girl, someone said, a princess by the way she carried herself even when she had nothing left to assert. Not a princess in the way of crowns and jewels, but in the evenness of her bearing, the way she kept her head level as if the world's insults did not touch the space behind her eyes. That was wrong and accurate both. She had scars along her wrists and a look that would make a man stop mid-sentence, because she had been through what most people only pretended to know about. The child with her, small, wild-eyed, and stubborn with hunger, clutched at her skirt and kept watch with the distrust of instinct. They camped near the river where the willows offered a bruise of shade and the water moved like a promise someone had forgotten to fulfill. The first time the rancher saw them, he was riding his best horse to check a fence post that had been complaining in the night. Red's hooves sank into the soft shoulder of the road and she tossed her head, and the girl looked up like someone recognizing a friend. He did not intend to stop. He had not intended to change much of anything. But the sight of them, so fragile still, bent something in him that had stopped bending years ago. He dismounted with a sprawl of quiet that only a man used to long distances can hold, and he stood there while the horse breathed like a counting of the years they had spent together. She did not beg. She watched him with the same steady eyes she had used to watch the road. He offered only a coat, the heavy one he kept by the door for nights when the frost laid like white ribs on the grass, and when he set it on her shoulders it made the world smaller in that instant. She flinched not from the coat's weight but from the attention of having her need acknowledged. She accepted it without a word and without slackening her stance. That night the rancher rode back to his house with an ache not more painful than the ache of memory, and yet it opened a vein he did not believe would ever bleed again. He could have ridden past. He knew the equations of a life that had learned to do without the trouble of rescuing strangers. He knew the quiet cost of letting things keep moving as they always had. A little more dust on his doorstep, a little more space in his bed. But he also knew the look of a child's hand clenched on an adult's skirt and the way that look could break something, or make something, in a man. In the morning he found himself saddling Red with a steadiness that suggested resolve rather than thought. The people of the town muttered when they saw him go, because in a place that kept careful tallies on one another's generosity, deeds had names and faces and gossip. He rode to the river not to be seen but because the thought of the girl, worn like a portrait under water, had lodged behind his ribs. When she lifted her head, a thin smile broke across her face as if she recognized the particular solitude in his own chest. He offered then, without ceremony and without a plan, to give Red his best horse. He said nothing of the cost or the weight of that surrender. The gesture was violent in its simplicity. It startled him the way a man is startled to discover he has lost a limb and yet can live. He told himself later he gave Red because the horse would be better to move a wagon, stronger to drag them if the road proved unkind. He told himself that to avoid admitting the truth. He had been lonely and the impulse to do something necessary for another had become a way to test whether his heart still worked. She took the horse with the care of someone stepping into a room where she had been declared unwanted but found a place to sit. She saddled Red with hands that remembered how to be gentle and quick. The child, wide-eyed, watched as if the horse were a new son. She did not ask him anything, not even a name. She did not see him as a man in need of an answer. She saw him as a presence in the periphery of a life that had been reduced to survival. He rode back alone. The house felt empty in a different way. He lay tools on the workbench and looked at them like instructions written in a language he almost remembered. He made more coffee and drank it. He sat in a chair by the stove and listened to the wood sing as it shriveled into flame. When a favor gives a man away, not in front of the world but in front of himself, it returns to him in the quiet of the kitchen when the kettle whistles and he cannot answer it. He had given away Red and with her the last of certain comforts. The world went on being the world. Seasons kept their appointments. The cow that had calved the week before found its balance. The fence mended itself in the same patterns of knots and curses. Yet at night he walked the ridge and watched for smoke from the river that might tell him if they were safe. He did not know why he did it, not in any way that would make sense on paper. He had a notion that some debts astronomical and some intimate require acts that are not ledgered. He had learned, beneath the years, a tenderness that needed a place to rest. Perhaps the girl with the child had also been given a place to rest by the world, if only briefly. He did not know then that the rest would come wrapped in complications and quiet miracles that would undo the neat contours of the life he had honed to a single edge. Days passed and they took to traveling between the river and his homestead. She would come once a week with a basket of river herbs, broad leaves and bitter roots that she pressed into the bread she made to barter for small things. Sometimes she brought a painted feather, sometimes a rope mended so neatly that he felt the honesty of labor in the knots. Once she brought his wife's old cup. How she had found it, he would never know, and set it on his table as if returning a piece of his past with no fanfare. He kept the cup like a relic and didn't wash it for a day, as if ceremony was still due somewhere in the ritual of ordinary things. The boy? He learned to call him Little Hawk only after evenings of slow conversation. grew fond of Red and would whisper secrets into the horse's ear as if the animal were an old woman who knew all the prayers. Sometimes the girl would sit on his porch and watch him work, and their silences braided into a type of fellowship. Not the boisterous kind that gets written about, but the steady kind that keeps a roof from leaking. He found himself measuring out coal and bread for them without considering their return. People noticed. The town decided on this behavior. He had gone soft, so they laughed or they pitted or they sharpened their tongues. Because in towns like that, a man's reputation like his fences demands upkeep. He paid no mind to the whispers. He had come to value whispers less than he valued the small steadiness of hands that look up and find a roof. There were moments that made him question his decision, moments that pulled the old maps of his life back into his hands like a comfort he could consult. One afternoon, a man from town, interested in the logic of business above all, came to see if the girl might be carrying something of value. Land, claim, an inheritance he could nudge through the right channels. He found her and the child at the river, Red grazing as if the world belonged wholly to his generosity and the horses. The man spoke quick, efficient sentences about contracts and obligation and proper paper. He looked at the girl as people often look at those who have less, measuring the angles of a person as if they were trinkets to be appraised. She listened, and when she answered, her voice cut the way a clean stone cuts a loaf, simple, dry, precise. The man smirked and asked whether the rancher had purchased the right to claim the girl's labor, whether there was a contract in blood or ink. She answered that there was no contract in anything but the choice of Red. She had taken the horse because it was a horse that made the difference between moving ahead and staying behind. The man laughed and left with a murmur and a calculation that would have liked to make a profit of things that were not for sale. The girl looked at him differently then, the way a person looks at a man who has decided, in a small and dangerous place, to do right by a child even when the market says otherwise. The winter loosened its grip and something else took its place, an early thaw that made the river sing in quick, excited bursts. Along with the thaw came illness in town. A cough that started in the poorest quarters and edged its way toward every neighborhood. Coughs travel like lottery tickets of fate. You never know who will draw the worst hand. The boy fell ill that week. It was nothing visible at first. He was tired with a tiredness that sat behind his eyes like a stone. He lay in the warm straw beneath a patched quilt and watched light move across the wall. Fever made his small face more honest than any smile. The girl paced and tended and wrapped towels around his head and whispered in a language the rancher did not know but recognized for its raw tenderness. He offered medicine he had been taught to keep for cattle, bruised willow bark, a tincture of sage, and found himself preparing it with hands that knew how to do what needed to be done without asking permission. He sat outside their door that night and watched as the girl slept a minute at a time because the child's breathing eased and then returned, as if the world were a pendulum they all waited on. He had nothing to give her but the warmth of a barn and the willingness of his labor. But that, to him, had become a kind of currency. There came a night when the boy's coughing rose like a tide and the color in his cheeks faded into a map of weather. The girl's hands trembled with a tiredness that broke open the measured shell he had learned to keep. She looked at him and asked, plainly, whether he had anything stronger than tinctures. She did not ask with the supplication of someone used to asking favors. She asked with the authority of a person expecting a human to be human. He rose and fetched blankets and boiled water. He set to steam and made a poultice from roots she did not name. It was an odd attic of knowledge between them, a give and take where no one tried to keep score. He worked through the night while a wind pressed at the rafters like a patient spectator and Red pricked her ears as if listening to something only horses can hear. When the dawn finally opened, the fever had broken, and the boy slept like a creature that had been allowed to be small again. The girl's face softened with a relief that pulled at something in his chest like a thread. He walked back to the house and let the sun warm his shoulders. He had put his hands into the danger of caring, and they came away not scorched but calloused in a different way, calluses of habit that would not let him forget how it felt to be needed. People in town began to change the way they looked at him. He could not say whether it was because they felt he had done something good or because they were surprised at how little it had cost him in the currency they understood. There were other judgments, too. Some thought he had made a poor business choice, giving away his best horse to a woman who would not be a wife and a child who was not his blood. They did not see what he had seen. They did not know that sometimes a horse is less about horsepower and more about the bridge it allows two kinds of sorrow to cross. He thought less of the town's talk than he did of the quiet that arrived on the porch when the girl came by with a basket of baked bread or braided grass. She stood on the edge of his life like a new post, unassuming and steady, and he found himself measuring out even the smallest kindnesses as if laying a foundation. He mended shoes for the boy in the evenings and taught him how to feed Red without fear. He did not tell the girl about the woman he had lost, but she found the cup and set it back in his hands, and something like a covenant passed between them without the form of words. That was how it began to change. Through goods exchanged, through shelter given, through little notes in the air that said I am here and you are not alone. Then the past showed up on a spring day like a bad wind, carrying men who thought their right to make trouble came from memories too stubborn to be ignored. They came from the town with their mockery, their petitions for the girl's removal, their petitions for the return of the horse because laws and money and lunging civic claims made an appetite for taking what pleased them. One of them, broad-shouldered, with a voice that had been honed in saloons, stood in front of the girl and accused her of theft, of lying, of using a man's generosity to carve out a place for herself she had no right to keep. He said words meant to sting, their edges softened by the crowd's lack of imagination. The girl did not bow her head. The boy clung to the hem of her skirt, eyes wide like an innocent accusation. The rancher walked out of his house and stood between them and the rest of the world with the same quietness. He used to keep the weather from beating his windows to pieces. He could have said much. He chose instead to say simply, in a voice that made the moment stop like the slow closing of a lid, "She's with me." Those 3 words were the exact size of the man they covered. There were no speeches. There was no sermonizing. There was a silence that filled the space like a new piece of furniture. The crowd, unused to a man refusing their story, shifted and cooled. He did not claim ownership in the sense the town wanted to measure. He claimed the choice he had made and the right she had to choose that life without being auctioned off to rumor. The man with the broad shoulders laughed and spat on the ground and left with the sort of cowardice that collects behind a belly. After that, the world altered in small increments. The girl's distrust thawed in slivers. She began to speak more at nights, when the fire was low and the horses were sleeping, telling stories of places that smelled of mesquite and of people who had names that were songs. He listened the way a man might listen to rain, not needing to catch every drop but knowing each was important. He told her nothing of the inside of his chest until the night when the wind was patient and the boy, in sleep, rolled into a breath that did not frighten the room. He told her there was a small grave on the hill and that sometimes he spoke to the name on the stone so the stone would not feel alone. She put a hand on his wrist that night without fanfare, and the touch was a small, steadying thing. It was not designed to fix or to heal. It was a witness. She said nothing then, but later, in a slow confession that needed no words, she gave him something that was beyond both of them, a sort of agreement. That she would stay if she could, that together they could make a place where silence was not neglect. He wanted to give her more than a place and a horse. He wanted to give her everything that the world had taken. He knew he could not. The only things he had that worth a damn were his labor, his roof, and the promise he could keep. She took them, and in so doing she gave him back a voice he had stopped listening for, the voice that said you can be necessary again, and that was a kind of miracle neither of them expected. The river kept its low, steady song as if nothing had changed, as if history could be unwound and cast back into its current. But there was a new steady in the life that had taken up the margin of that slow ribbon of water. Little Hawk grew taller in the weeks after he stopped laying still and gasping. His cheeks rounded back into a child's persistence, and his cough softened into the dry, bright laugh of a boy who had been given back his mornings. Red came and went between hoof prints on the mud and the woman's hand that fed him when she could spare a scrap, and wherever the horse went Little Hawk followed, a small shadow in a hat that was still too big. The rancher watched them both with the small movements that meant much. A hand on a fence post for a moment longer, the tilt of an ear toward the river where the girl bent to wash her hair in a battered basin. He had been a man used to long distances inside a quiet heart. Now his days belonged to small routes, paths from barn to river to house, and the work of making a place safe for two more. They began at the edge of the moor with trade more than conversation. She would bring mending of nets and the bark-sweet herbs she picked from the thin gullies and leave them wrapped in cloth near the back door. He would set out a loaf and a small tin of lard. The sheriff's men passed sometimes, curious eyes slow over the homestead, always with the weight of a town's gossip in their collars. The broad-shouldered antagonist visited once, on a day when the sky sat high and sharp, and his laugh carried over the yard like a challenge. He wanted the girl named and listed, wanted to have property and claim on someone who carried only 2 loose sacks and a small boy. The town had not forgotten the old rules, and men like him moved with them as if the rules were a thing that could be lifted and given to the highest hand. The rancher answered once, and the words were few. "She's with me." Those 3 words had the steadiness of a man who knew the weight of them, and they had the effect they were meant to have. The crowd softened. The antagonist tried to press it further, to make of the girl an argument he could win with money or law, but the rancher had the stubbornness of a man who'd lost more than he could name and learned what was left. He had refused to measure his loss against others' greed. He stood with a hand on the girl's shoulder for the first time in months, and when he did the gesture he did not let go. The girl did not lean away. She flinched like someone who had grown used to being marked and then relaxed like someone discovering the steadiness of a fence post at night. The first winter after Little Hawk's illness was a lean one. The creek froze to glass before dawn, and the stove at the rancher's house burned slow and patient embers into the nights. The girl learned to chop wood in small, careful strokes that made the piece come away without jaggedness. The rancher showed her where to tuck the cord of firewood so that snow would not soak it, and how to mend cloth with a stitch that would hold when hands were wet and cold. Little Hawk learned which rocks along the river held minnows there in a pocket of warm when the rest of the water went hard, and he learned how to let Red sniff the back of his neck and stand still with a trust that impressed every adult who saw it. The small house acquired a rhythm, the kind that comes from shared labor. A pot left soaking to soften at dusk became a reason for a quiet conversation. A boot mended by the window became the conversation's subject. They ate together. They woke early. There was no boasting, only the measured tilt of living. Rumors softened into acceptance, then to a kind of small respect. A widow on the next stretch of land sent a jar of pickled plums with a folded note that said, "Take it for the child." The blacksmith, who had watched from his forge and measured the newcomer with a blunt glance, left a repaired bit and said nothing. The girl left him a sprig of dried herb on the anvil in return. People found ways to give what they could without making spectacle. The antagonist found his spite less rewarded by the town's ears and so left his threats at the usual bar, where men heard them and put them in the pocket with the rest of their grievances. Spring arrived soft and tentative. The river let go of its crust and moved again with the voice of water that suggested more than warmth. The grass around the homestead put on a thin, scraggy green like a promise hurriedly kept. The rancher watched the girl from the corner of his days, how she moved, how she tilted her head like someone listening to seeds beneath the soil, and he found that he had begun to count herself and Little Hawk into the sum of his future. He was cautious about this calculation. Caution had been the habit of his years. He told himself, with a tone that was more formal habit than conviction, that he did not intend to change the farm in ways that would offer strangers more than necessary. Then he repaired the child's bed frame with dovetailing that took him 2 nights, and when he set it by the wall he felt a small, stubborn pleasure that was like a seed finally set into ground. There were small celebrations that first year that felt like rain on a dry field rather than the full opening of a flood. Little Hawk talked in his sleep sometimes, and the rancher sat awake on the porch listening, because those were sounds that meant the child was not losing his grip on the world anymore. The girl made a cradle for the boy out of spare slats, and when she painted the cradle with a thin wash of color, she chose a soft ochre that matched the dusk. She had learned to put a small pot of broth on the stove for the rancher when he was late from the field, and he, in turn, had set aside a place for her on the list of his concerns when hay needed stacking and fences mending. Each small courtesy was a stitch. Then the antagonist returned, and he returned with a law in his pocket. It was a claim, half-crafted and handed off with a civility that tried to mask the hunger underneath. He had discovered, through the town's undercurrents and whispers, what he thought might be his due. A thing he could take and make law around. The paper was thin with a signature and a town judge's mark. It insisted the land bordering the river belonged in part to a distant company that had never paid its taxes and now wanted its rights made plain. He wanted the girl out. He wanted to make of her presence a fault line that would justify a claim and, possibly, the offer of a paltry price. He presented the paper to the rancher the way a man might present a knife. The rancher read it as if each line were a cold stone. He did not flinch at the formalities. He closed the paper with a hand that trembled, but not with fear. The tremble was something else, a measure of time spent and the knowledge of how easily things could be drawn apart. He could have argued with lawyers. He could have taken the deed to the town and fed it to the same old furnace that had dealt with more than one greedy hand. But the truth he had made himself accept was harsher than the law's cold pages. The town sometimes bends to the measure of what it wants. So he chose another way. When the antagonist returned to make his next move, the rancher stood in the yard with the girl at his side and Little Hawk at his feet. The men who came with the antagonist had boots that scuffed the soil with intent, and their voices were made of the same kind of certainty. The rancher walked out in front of them, hat in hand at his chest, and he spoke softly. He spoke not to the words on paper but to the thing the words tried to touch. He said that the land had needed them, and that they had answered. He said that the girl had nowhere else to go and that the boy, who had been nearly lost, belonged to the mornings and the river and the horse that would not leave him. He did not raise his voice, but he did not slink and explain either. The town heard the steadiness in him and felt the truth as something it could not easily undo. There was a lawyer from town who arrived then with a briefcase and the patience of someone who lived on arguments. He combed the papers with small, polite movements, and he smiled as if he found the puzzle amusing. But when he looked up and saw the rancher's hand resting, casual and steady, on the girl's shoulder, something in his smile closed. He had not expected to find a man who kept his word as rock. He had expected to find a collection of needs he could catalog. He asked, with the courteous precision of his trade, if the rancher would be willing to take the claim to court. The rancher considered, and then he said simply, "I will stand where I stand now." The lawyer understood that to mean he would not move to play law's game unless the town itself moved its hand. Without the town to feed the antagonist's quarrel, the claim started to look like a bluster more than a possibility. The antagonist left, and his men left, with slow steps that were too loud for the yard they wanted to leave. After that, the yard felt like a border both fragile and more strong than any fence. The rancher took to sleeping in the room nearest the door, where he could hear the river's breath and the sound of little feet moving softly in the night. There were nights when the girl would come to the door, carrying a small cup, and she would offer it to him without words. He would accept and taste the thin tea she made, a bitter herb that warmed and steadied, and they would stand there for a time in silence that had grown friendly and not the old, fearful sort. Once, in the small hours, Little Hawk fussed in his sleep and then cried out, and the rancher went to him as if to an old duty. The boy tangled in the blankets and reached for the rancher's hand, and when the rancher touched his hair the child smiled against the cotton. That smile lodged under the man's ribs like a small found coin. Summer taught them the quiet of shared harvest. The girl planted beans in a patch by the kitchen and called them her small rows of luck. Little Hawk helped, wearing a hat the rancher had mended, and the rancher lifted a sack of grain more than once without complaint. Red carried the girl out to the farther reaches where the wild grass grew, and the horse's soft breath against the girl's cheek was a new kind of presence in the rancher's life. A thing smaller and more human than he had allowed himself to expect. When they sat on the porch in the evenings, Red in the yard and the river murmuring, the rancher and the girl would trade small news, who had heard a wheel on the road, who had a child that took to the blacksmith's apron, whether the widow's plums were more sweet this year. They spoke in necessary words, and in gestures that had become language. A pot set out, a coat hung by the door, a hand left on a shoulder and not withdrawn. The person the rancher had been, quiet, withdrawn, a man who kept a garden and a carved chair for himself and his dead wife's picture under glass, began to shape around the new needs without losing itself. He could still sit long in silence and listen to the dark. He could still go for a walk and think on the old times. But he also turned the yard regular with the work of keeping two more safe. When a storm took a branch and smashed the lean pole that held their washing line, he did not grumble about the extra chore. He rebuilt it with an even hand, and when he set the line again he smiled to himself, an almost private thing. The girl watched him make the line and then hummed as she pinned shirts to the cord, a sound that came from some place that had room enough for a small happiness. Autumn brought a test. The antagonist, having found his legal path barred by the town's quiet resistance and the lawyer's lack of interest, shifted his aim. He did not come with papers now but with men who said they had been wronged and that rights could be settled by more than law. They came one evening when the light was thin and the sky was the color of a dull coin. They shouted at the girl, calling names that had no right to be spoken, and they pushed the boy with hands that were too heavy for his small shoulders. The rancher came out of the house like a man pulled by a long rope. He did not shout. He did not move with the quick, reckless fear that would have made him less than he was. He set himself between the men and the child, and he put his hands on the shoulders of the nearest of the antagonist's men. They were broad and strong, but the rancher was steadier. "You will not touch them," he said. Word by word he carved out a space the men could not cross. They tried to talk over him, to make their threats into the sort of thing that adds up to a victory in a saloon. But the rancher's voice had a quality they had not expected. The certainty of someone who has been alone and who has decided that alone is a poorer thing than the world will sometimes reward. The townspeople who had seen the scuffle, neighbors, the blacksmith, the widow, came out with small weapons of their own. A broom, a pitchfork, the mere fact of their bodies. The antagonist's men looked around and discovered they had miscounted. One by one they eased back, turning their threats into curses that the wind carried away. The antagonist himself stayed a moment longer, his face hard and small, and then he left with a promise that sounded like a threat and a warning at once. The rancher watched him go and felt, with a dull satisfaction, that deeds had been done that would stand. When peace returned, they did not speak of it much. People do not make feasts of storms that have been weathered. Instead, they gather the broken things and use them again. The rancher repaired a board on the porch, and the girl baked a loaf of bread that had a warmth like a hug. Little Hawk learned to thread a needle and then to repair a toy horse he had broken earlier in the summer. They set about the business of living together with a new calm, as if the world had finally agreed to let them keep their small bank of days. In the end, the change was not made all at once by speech or sudden confession but by a series of soft acceptances. One evening, when the river had turned the color of old pewter and the air had that cold edge that makes you fold yourself inward like a pocket, the rancher sat in his rocker with the girl across from him. Little Hawk lay by the stove with Red's mane reaching through the chinks of the door. The rancher had a cup of the bitter tea in his hands. The girl had a small dish with slices of the bread she had baked. He looked at her then and saw, as plainly as a man can see where the light is thin, that the lines on her face had softened. The hard places that had been mapped by distrust were less open now. She met his eyes without flinching. There was a question lodged in both their chests like a small stone. Neither of them spoke it directly. The rancher had learned that some things are answered by the continuing of life rather than by its naming. The girl understood this. She reached out and took the rancher's hand, calloused from years of work. Her fingers were small and sure. She did not ask him if he would take her in and call it home. Instead, she fitted her hand into his and held it there. He returned the pressure, and something uncomplicated and honest passed between them that needed no elaboration. They married in the small way that two people who had never liked pomp do. By agreement before the town registrar who wrote the words in a book and then left them alone with the paper and the quiet. There were no fanfares. The widow came and brought the plum jar, the blacksmith brought a new horseshoe, and Little Hawk brought a bouquet of weeds wrapped in paper. Red was present, as he always was, nuzzling the girl's shoulder while she pinned a bit of fabric into her hair. They did not say vows in the loud way the people in town did. Instead, the rancher and the girl exchanged simple promises. That they would stand where they stood now, that the boy would be kept safe, that each would do their part. The words had the weight of the things they described. Not promises designed to make a scene, but commitments that would be honored with action. Years folded in like pages. The crops did well more often than they did not. The antagonist moved away to a place that had less patience for his way of life. The rancher's hands aged further, but they kept their work, and the girl's laugh softened into the domestic music of the house. Little Hawk learned to write, clumsy at first and then with a neatness that pleased his mother. He learned to ride Red without fear, and the horse took to the boy with a patience that matched the child's. The house grew warmer with years of plates and stories stacked in drawers. There was a shiplap rocker carved by the rancher for the girl, its arms smoothed by the touch of small hands. Once, when a highwayman came through, another man who thought the law was a rule to be used for his profit. He saw the rancher's steadiness and went on his way. He did not try his luck where people knew how to hold what was theirs. One bright afternoon, many seasons on, the rancher walked to the hill behind the house where the grave lay beneath a small cairn of stones. He carried some of the plum preserves she had liked and a cup of tea. He sat by the marker and thought of the wife he had lost and the life they had shared, and he felt not a tearing but a gentle gratitude for the years they had given him and for the years that had come after. He spoke to the grave quietly, as if addressing an old friend, and he told her of the girl and the boy, of how the house had filled and how the river had kept its promise to carry good things forward. He stood then and went back, because work waited and because a life of the quiet sort does not permit endless remembering when there are chores to be done. There was peace in his step that had not been purchasable in the way fortune's men speak. At night, when the wind rolled low in the stove threw an honest heat across the room, the rancher would listen to the small sounds of his family. The girl moving about as she patched a shirt, Little Hawk's breathing like a small, well-tuned bell, Red's slow snuffles from the yard. He would think of how wilderness had once felt like an accusation and now felt like a wide-armed friend. He would remember the first time he had seen the girl and the boy camped by the river, the way he had given his coat and then given his best horse, and he would marvel inwardly at how giving had returned to him more than he had thought possible. It was not what he would have called joy in words that made men famous. It was a steady, honest kind of contentment that sits in the chest like a steady ember. When the last gray hairs threaded his beard more fully, the rancher knew the time would come when he would not be the first to wake and the last to sleep. They had talked in that vague, practical way older people talk when they prepare for the passing of responsibility. Little Hawk, now taller and steadier, had learned the ways of the land and the trade of mending and feeding. The girl had the same clear stone in her heart that the rancher had the habit of keeping, a dedication to a life of order and mercy. They made arrangements with the same quiet dignity with which they had lived everything else. The rancher set aside tools and taught the boy the manner of stacking hay so that winter would not steal at them. He tied knots and showed Little Hawk how to read the sky for rain. He wrote a short note, simple and plain, and left it in the old drawer where the wife's photograph slept. It said, in the straightforward hand he had always had, that he had been given a second life and that he had used it well. He did not die with fanfare. He went gently, the way men well-lived do, with the river's voice in his ears and the girl's hand in his. Little Hawk sat at the bed and folded the man's hand into his palm as if closing a book. The girl, no longer the girl who had come with 2 sacks and a hat too big, rested her forehead on the man's and whispered a thing that was equal parts thanks and farewell. He breathed once, slow and unfussy, and then he was not there in the way he had been. The house felt the change like a momentary winter, a sharpness, then the settling of snow. They buried him on the hill by the woman he had loved before, under the same small cairn that now held the names of those he loved. They did not stage a spectacle. A small group of neighbors came, the blacksmith among them, the widow with her quiet face. They spoke of the man's steadiness and of the small grace he had brought to their town. Little Hawk placed a stone on the mound as the girl poured a cup of earth over the grave. Red nuzzled the boy and then stood, quiet as a sentinel, on the edge of the grass. Life went on in the house. The girl kept the rancher's coat on the peg by the door for a time, and then one day she took it down and mended it so it would not look as if she kept it as a relic. She used it in the field and she let Little Hawk borrow it when he went out in the early chill. She carried on with the routines the rancher had taught her. The stove lit at night, the bread set to rise by the window, the fence checked after storms. She taught the boy to hold Red's bridle with the respect a living creature deserved and to speak softly when he wished the horse to move. The house shone with the small accretions of a life. It was not a palace, but it was a home that had been hard-won and therefore more precious. Years later, people in town would say that the rancher had died but left something behind that no money could buy. The sense that a man could make his life into something that held room for others. They would tell the story of how he had given away his best horse and his coat, and how he had stood in the face of men who thought power came from paper and not from the steadiness of a hand by your shoulder. They would tell it as a lesson, and they would tell it with the warmth of people who had lived through seasons and found the right measures for living. And the house by the river kept its own small music. The creek singing, the creak of the porch, the distant bark of a dog who belonged to a farm further down. Little Hawk grew into a man who had the rancher's hands and the girl's heart. He took Red on journeys to visit the town and came back with news of a world that turned and sometimes surprised. The girl grew older, dignified in a way that came from having endured and having offered. The porch rocker the rancher had carved was forever smoothed by two hands, and the window that looked out over the river never failed to show a sky that told of long horizons. From dust and silence grew a home. From closed hearts, a family. The little kindness given at the river, an old coat, a horse, a steady hand, had multiplied into more than the sum of its parts. It turned out to be, the people who had watched agreed, a small kind of miracle. A quiet mercy that asked no applause and granted those who lived under it the simple privilege of belonging. We will see you again where silence means home.